So, right in your introduction, it was really difficult to know how to describe you based on the vast achievements you fulfilled. Therefore, I'd be interested to know how you describe yourself. In your opinion, why do you think media is so eager to put labels on talented people who don't really fall into one category?
Oh, wow. Straight in. That's a great question. Well, it depends who I'm talking to, really. If I'm talking to a cab driver, I'll often say that I work at Argos because when I was a kid, I worked at Argos. So if there are any follow-up questions, I've got all the answers about how the stockroom works. And I don't have to have them maybe pitch a script or a sitcom or a book idea to me.
Oh,
But really, I suppose at the heart of everything I do, I'm just a writer. And that's how everything started for me. That's what I enjoy doing the most, I think. That's at the heart of every single thing that I do, whether it's a book or a script or a grown-up book or a novel or a kid's book or jokes for the radio or whatever it might be. It's all in the fingers, in the brain and the fingers for that. And then I sort of I give that a go. So, and why people are so keen to label, I don't know. It's a funny thing when I've had it a few times in my career where people, they don't know what to make of me because they don't really know what I do, because I try and do as much as I can. And the trick is to try and do it well, because then you'll get asked to do more things. But it always starts with just me and a computer.
yeah.
Can you remember any of Argo number?
Josh said, can you remember all the Argos numbers?
Not all of them, but I'll tell you what, there was these guys in the stockroom, because I didn't know how Argos worked. I thought it was magic, but it's sort of like a weird little. I suppose these days it's like Amazon, except you pick your stuff up immediately, and someone types in what they want, and then this little ticket machine. This is quite a while ago. It's probably changed a lot since then. A little ticket machine would spurt out a little number on a bit of paper, and the people who'd been there a while, they would see the number come up and they would know immediately that's not an item that they wanted to get. So they'd like take a step back or pretend to stretch, and then I'd get it. And it would literally turn out to be weightlifting equipment. And I would have to go and drag weightlifting equipment through the stockroom and then somehow hoist it onto the conveyor belt. So they were smart. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
They would always get like Barbie dolls and stuff.
Yeah, good product knowledge.
Yeah.
So you graduated from university with a degree in media studies in the 90s, which I imagine was a different experience to what it is today. How do you
Yeah.
think attitudes towards the media, towards media related degrees have changed since that time?
That's a brilliant question. I'm a big champion of media studies, and I think that if more people had done media studies around the same time I was doing media studies, quite a lot of the mess that we're in now, we wouldn't be in, because we would know about sources, and we'd know about media ownership, and we'd know about media law, and we'd know about truth, and we'd know how easy it is for stories to be leading the reader one way or another, because this was all stuff that I was doing. I was like finding out about while the media itself was making fun of me. And they used to make fun of us. Like, I remember phoning up talk radio in the late 90s because they were like really slating media studies and saying, all you do is you watch an episode of EastEnders and you do this or that. And I was like, here's all the things that we do. And they were having none of it, because the idea was that it was just it was a DOS, it was easy. But the things that we learn, and I also learned the craft and how to analyze films and how to think about structure and how to actually make stuff that I wanted to make. I had all these ideas and no idea what to do with them. And that's, if you are working in Argos and you've got these ideas, it's kind of limiting what you can do at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But if you've got that equipment at that university, and you can then work out how the people that you like have made stuff and then try and do that, it's really useful. And I think probably attitudes now have matured towards media studies, and also attitudes towards things like EastEnders. You know, that would be an insult. They would say, you probably just watched an episode of EastEnders. Think about the drama and the storytelling and the craft of creating a long-running, continuing drama like EastEnders. How does that work? How do you, what is the secret of it? It's not just people arguing, you know, in a laundrette, although those are always the best ones, when two people get stuck in the laundrette overnight. Just have like a 30-minute chat and it's just a character study. It's like Ibsen or something. It's, you know, anyway, I don't know what I'm talking about now, but that, you know, I think the attitudes have definitely changed, and that media study and the study of what is happening now. Think about, we're recording this a day after the Kate Middleton photo release story, where suddenly people who weren't aware of kind of AI manipulation or Photoshop or imagery or PRs or brands or kill orders from picture agencies. These are all like things that people are learning in the last 24 hours. And they're all things that we should all learn really anyway. And maybe it's time to bring it more into schools. I hope that long but passionate championing of media. Right.
I remember that and he started of saying it you
Josh, he remembers when he was 16, he did a lecture hosted by the BBC about becoming a writer. And they said, if you do a degree in media, you'll never become a writer at the BBC. So that was 20 years ago. And wonder if that's probably something which has changed now, because like you say, there's so many other things involved in being a writer, like you say, with the law and those sort of nuances with it, that you kind of have to know a bit more than just how to write something nicely to, you know, do.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that now it's almost like a prerequisite, like you're saying, like just a bit of world awareness, because the media has just come into our lives much more than ever before with, you know, our phones. The fact that we are bombarded now with articles from every corner of the earth, with, you know, different newspapers that we'd never have, you know, in the old days, you'd have probably bought one newspaper a couple of times a week, and then that was your thing. And now you're being, you know, you're getting articles from like the Boston Globe or like something from Tuvalu, and you're taking it at face value, but you don't know really what's behind a lot of these newspapers. And I think that the BBC, yeah, I mean, I joined the BBC as a producer in the late 90s, straight after media studies. And you know what? It really helped me, because in those days, things were, you had a guy in a studio whose job it was to edit certain shows, and he was the only person who could do it. And it was usually a he. And then suddenly I turn up and I had digital editing experience because of university, and I knew how to do it. So I could make my own shows. But that came with it a bit of suspicion, and there was some snobbery from a couple of areas, from people who were more Oxbridge than I was, who were a little bit suspicious of my so-called wishy-washy former polytechnic. But it was brilliant, and it was exactly what I needed. And I would not be talking to you now unless I'd done it. And in fact, when I left for London, I had as a teenager written a lot for video games magazines. There happened to be two great things in my town. One was an Argos, and one was the video games magazines. And this was in Bath, and I was allowed to go there, and I would write for these mags. And they wanted me to stay, and I was going to go to university. And someone very high up at this company said to me, "You're going off to do what? Media studies?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "If anyone came to my business and they had done media studies, I would just fold up their CV and just hand it back to them, and they would not get a job." And I thought, this is like living in the past. This is ridiculous, you know. And so I said, "Well, I'm doing it." And I said, "If it goes wrong, I'll be back in a few years, and I bet you give me a job anyway." And luckily I didn't have to. So, but that's the thing. Media, yeah, frowned upon, pompous, but actually hugely important.
Yeah, it leads on really nicely, actually. Josh's next question. The striking thing about your career is that you joined the BBC as a sort of junior producer at the moderately tender age of 22, in the era where I guess the opportunities were, and probably still are, pretty hard to come by. Looking back now, what benefits did working at the corporation offer you, and how was that in terms of shaping your career? Do you think there's still such a thing as a devout BBC personality?
I think when I joined the BBC, and you know, I have huge affection and admiration for the BBC. I think when I was there was a certain sense of loyalty. There was loyalty, proper loyalty from the people working for the BBC, and there was loyalty from the BBC to the people working for it. And I'm not sure whether that has diluted, whether that is just the fact there's so much more competition now, whether the fact that people have to, maybe it's easier to move jobs, maybe big corporations have to be more ruthless. But I think that some of that has gone because it was the jewel, wasn't it? It was the cultural jewel in the crown, and I was so happy and proud to work there. You know, when you get your BBC pass on your BBC lanyard with the BBC logo, and you end up with the BBC office, and you find on your top shelf, as I did, all these old awards certificates that were all from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which had been just forgotten and left up there, and you're like holding kind of history. Part of that was just kind of just wonderful and magical, and I really did enjoy my time there. What I wasn't that into was working in an office, and I managed to convince the boss, who I owed a lot to. He's the guy that gave me the job, and who was like my mentor, and a kind of a sort of dad in my career for those years, John Pigeon. He just wanted to make good stuff, and he didn't want to be part of that whole BBC machine, which is just about numbers and money and spreadsheets. He wanted good people to turn up, go to the pub with him, come up with good ideas, and then make them. And that included the likes of Ross Noble and the Boosh, and it was that kind of era. And Pigeon, he was just great at that. He was a very unusual, and he was a sort of like a Renaissance man. We talked about me doing lots of different things. He did lots of different things that if he told you he'd done late one night in a bar, you would walk away thinking, he seems normal, but I think he might be mad. Because he started telling you about the time he was on tour with Rod Stewart, like in somewhere in Dundee, he got lost and knocked over by a bunch of Rod Stewart fans. And then you'd be like, is this true? And then he'd pull out the authorized biography of Rod Stewart, and like, it's him, he's done it. Or I think he wrote some weird, I want to say fan fiction, but no, what do you call it? Fictionalized account of the band Slade. There was some other novel where it's like, you know, Slade go crazy in Skegness or something. So he'd had an unusual career as well. So I think we got on because of things like that. Yeah, it was a good time. It was a nice time at the BBC. I did enjoy it a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Josh says it's a bit like Nessa from Gavin and Stacey.
Yeah. I'm sure he'd be delighted by that. but yeah, no, because he'll tell you a story. He would just, like, Michael Jackson came up in conversation, and he'd just go, "I would tell you about the time I went to the Neverland Ranch." Well, sorry, what? He's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. I had to go. He said I had to go and interview Michael Jackson, but Janet was there, and Michael, or it might have been Latoya, one of the sisters was there, and Michael didn't want to answer my questions, so I had to ask Janet, and then Janet would then ask me the question, and then I would have to respond to Janet, and then Janet would then explain it to Michael Jackson. And you think this is insane. There's no way. And then you find it online, and there's an actual recording of it. So yeah, very much like Netta.
That sort of time frame coincided with an explosion of creativity, which climaxed with the creation of BBC Three. As someone who was integral to the comedy output of that time, why do you think that era became responsible for so much comedy content?
Well, a lot of comedy can be reasonably cheap. It can be a funny person and a microphone, which is why we see so many singer-songwriters these days, because they're much cheaper to tour. You know, it's easier to have a man or a woman with a guitar than it is this entire huge thing going on. So I think partly that, partly because it was quite easy, I suppose, to identify future people who could take up a bit of space on the new sort of real estate of BBC Three and the rest of it. People would just have to go up to Edinburgh. There was a time where Edinburgh was just crawling with people with business cards, handing them out to. I mean, it was like a glory time that for stand-ups, I think, that then led to, you know, quite a boom of besuited stand-ups. And it was an interesting time as well, because it was a good time for younger comics or double acts as well, because BBC Three had to serve them, so people were getting chances that perhaps they wouldn't have got quite so quickly. And I remember that time. I remember one of the fellow trainees, when I was a trainee. I remember I was right next to him when this is how long ago it was. The fax machine started up. That's always exciting. And then a fax came out, and it was the first radio scripts of Little Britain from Matt Lucas and David Walliams, and it was going to, you know, the guy in the office with me, and then going with him to see it recorded, and the huge whoofs of laughter from those early Little Britons, which I think we can look back on and say were of their time. And then I was working with the Boosh, and people were, you know, always stopping by the office, you know, Lee Mack, and just funny people. It was a really good time. I remember Ricky Jason, Steve Merchant were upstairs, and we went to lunch one day, and I was going, "So what is it? What's the thing you're doing again?" And Ricky was like, "Oh, it's like a sort of like a documentary, but it's like a comedy. It's a comedy, but it's like it's about an office." And I was like, "Ah, what's it called?" And he went, "The Office." And I remember thinking, "Yeah, good luck with that." You know, it sounds appalling. But I believe it. I believe it did all right.
Yeah, I think I've heard of it. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
You mentioned Boosh there. That sort of provided BBC Three with a cult hit, which had its roots firmly set in that Python and the Goons era. How difficult was it to make surrealism relevant for 21st century audiences? And looking back, how important was the Mighty Boosh in sort of subtly changing the direction of post-millennial comedy?
Wow. Well, they became like rock stars, didn't they? I worked on the radio show with them, a radio show that Radio 4 did not want. They were very clear. They said, this is 1 million miles away from what we want on Radio 4. And it was John Pidgeon that I mentioned earlier who managed to come up with a scheme, a plan, which was to find some money from, there was a local radio fund for BBC London. And that meant that we could therefore make the Boosh, but very, very, very cheaply. I don't really think Julian and Noel got any money for it, or if they did, they spent it all on flying Rich Fulcher over from America, which was another thing we couldn't afford to do. And we tried to record it in a studio, but felt too staid, and we found a place called Kingsland Road in Shoreditch. There was like a disused disco, and there was a back room that stank and was just brick. And we had to, Noel went out and got velvet and stuffed animals and created a sort of weird little studio that we then moved to the former men's toilets. So we recorded a Radio 4 show in a men's toilet with Rich Vulture, who has a very different delivery from Julian and Noel. He shouts a lot. So a lot of my job was riding the levels and trying not to go deaf from his incredible shouting. And anyway, cut long story short, Radio 4 heard it and went, do you know what? We actually like this. So they put it out at 11 at night once. And it got some complaints, but it got lots of younger listeners. And that excited Radio 4. And the next move was for BBC 3. And Julian and Noel asked me if I wanted to come along and produce. But the thing is, it would have been way beyond me. I didn't know anything about producing TV at that point. And these ideas, to make them real, like, it's all right for them. They can just go, then we're going to have a massive porpoise race on Venus. But I don't know how much it costs, you know? I have no idea how much is a porpoise or a fake porpoise. So how do we film that even? So, but Steve Coogan had heard it, and just he said it was so cool it made him want to be in the Boosh. So he was a huge fan of theirs, and so created this thing, which is where it really exploded. And what was particularly lovely for me was I remember, you know, sitting around talking with them about these characters or listening in this little room as we sort of put the thing together. And then suddenly, a couple of years later, I'm at, like, I don't even know where, Brixton Academy maybe, or one of the huge music venues, and it's packed with thousands of people, many of whom are dressed as the characters that they invented one day, you know, on a whim for the radio show or put in their telly stuff. And that was a really big moment for me, seeing, oh my God, the little ideas, the things that you put out into the world, you know, can really connect with people. And the boys did that on a massive scale, to the point where I remember you know, there was a party afterwards, and then I went out a side door to try and find a cab. And I've never felt so, like, I've never disappointed so many people. I walked out and I just heard people going, ah, because I wasn't Noel or Julian. I was, wow, thanks a lot. And then, so then I, you know, managed to get out there. But that was a moment where I really did think that it helped shape some of a section of the culture. The Boosh did. People started talking slightly differently. The surrealism you mentioned became a more sort of accessible type of surrealism. People mock that kind of surrealism in the same way that they mock observational comedy, but give either a try and see what you can come up with that's better than Noel Fielding or Michael McIntyre. It's really not, it's not that easy to connect with people in that way, maybe particularly with surrealism.
Beyond comedy, you've carved out a successful career as a broadcaster. What do you remember about the game show Schools Out? Josh, little favourite for Josh. Why do you think it only ran for one season?
Well, do you know what? We actually got two, but they were put on different. You know, it used to be a Wednesday night show, I think, for some reason, like Wednesday, maybe Wednesday at 7. What would now be the one show slot, and then it got promoted to Saturday nights, but maybe at 6:30 or something. So part of that kind of family thing. I think it was a nice show. So the idea of the show was, here's all the things your kids are being taught every day, and you should really know this stuff too. So at home, you can play along, because it's like, mum and dad probably don't know that history answer, but your big sister might, or your little sister might, or your brother. And so it kind of brings everyone together. And what I remember of it was being scared, because I've always tried to do things that scare me a bit, or that I haven't done before. And it's meant that I've tried a lot of different things. And some I'm better at than others. And I wasn't sure what I'd be like as a sort of, because I was hosting it as a kind of teacher figure. And so you're sort of maintaining a slight character while trying to keep it warm because the contestants were terrified. There was just an element of fear around Schools Out because I now realize because I'm having to remember all this stuff about I've got to know all this, the answers to everything. And I didn't know anything. And all the contestants are absolutely certain we're going to humiliate them because they're not going to know what 5 + 5 is or whatever. But it turned into a really nice sort of warm show. And we had the French rounds where they have to maintain a conversation entirely in French with a slightly strict French school teacher. There was like a music round where they'd have to join in with their recorders. And it would be horrific. And then there'd be all the general knowledge. And I remember when we were thinking, is it coming back for a third series? I remember having a meeting with an executive who basically, so right after School's Out, they went to pitch it in America. And the people they pitched it to happened to come up with, are you smarter than a third grader or a fourth grader, whatever it's called? So they had something similar in their wheelhouse, as they would have said. And then I remember the BBC exec just saying to me, we really like the show, but the problem is what we really want is, are you smarter than a third grader? And I was like, oh, okay, because that's not our show. And she's like, no, but that's what we want. And I was like, yeah, because Sky have got that, of course. She's like, yeah, but that's what we want. So it was very much a kind of, there's a better show out there now, go away, which was a shame, but it is something that happens.
Yeah. But for a while, you were one of the BBC's go-to light entertainment TV hosts. As someone who come up through that comedy exec route, did this come as a surprise to you? Big question. Why do you think TV isn't as loyal as radio?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I did do quite a bit all at once when there was one controller who really liked my stuff, and he would get me in to do if something was live, he knew that I could handle that, and maybe if there was a problem, I could get us out of it. You know, that's rather than freeze up and stare at the camera. So things would go wrong, and I would love it when they'd go wrong. And I prefer live to pre-recorded because pre-recorded, you know, it takes all the fun out of it, and you have to just keep doing it until you get it right. Whereas live, if it goes wrong, that's great because you've then got to solve it before all the smart asses at home have made fun of you, you know. So things like, yeah, Test the Nation, that sort of went wrong once or twice, but it was fun to play with. And yeah, and this commissioner sadly was kind of, well, what was it? Was he given the elbow? It was all around the time that a trailer had gone out that made the Queen look angry. And there was a big kerfuffle because apparently it was edited to make her look like that. And then he had to fall on his sword. And so he went, and then they kind of cleaned house. But at the time, I was about to, was I? Yeah, Yes Man. The film was about to come out, which is based on one of my books. And that then gave me a sort of a different focus and a kind of a different place to go. And I went off and spent a lot of time over there with that and a couple of other projects. So it didn't feel like a big kind of shift in my life. It was just like, oh, I'm going to do this now for a bit. But I do think probably radio is more loyal to people than TV because it's you're cultivating an audience and you're with them the whole time. My problem with TV, such as it was not a huge problem, but I like to be invited into your home. Do you know what I mean? And there's something about radio that says,
Yeah.
I'm your mate and this is our thing. And it's kind of intimate and there's a connection. And with TV, you're sort of turning up uninvited. And it means that when you're walking around on the street, there was a period where I absolutely hated it because the people who would recognize me were it was just because they'd seen me on telly. There was no connection. So you're just a thing. So they'll like be taking pictures of you in the pub, or they will tell you exactly what they think of you.
Oh.
Sometimes in not the most polite way, and they don't mean to be rude, but they just don't know what they're doing. And with the books and with radio, it's much more like someone will come up to me and tell me they've read one of my books, and if I know what the book is, then I feel like I've spent that time with them, and I know what they know about me, and we can talk about certain things. So there's that connection. So I think that I think that's a smart thing you've pointed out there, the idea of loyalty and the idea of connection.
Hmm. So speaking of BBC, you were the first person in 43 years to be asked to front an episode of the flagship BBC science series Horizon. In today's multi-platform landscape, what role do you think shows like Horizon still have on our greater understanding of the world?
Well, I think that the BBC is lucky that shortly after they found Brian Cox, because having someone like me do it is kind of fun, but I'm discovering the science as we go because I don't know it. And what you really need is someone who knows what they're talking about, but can communicate it in that great way that people like him do. And I think that the BBC should be doing stuff that is obviously smart, and they should stop assuming that people are dumb. There are ways of communicating huge ideas, but in ways that we can all understand. And I think that's where the heart of the BBC should be, in those kind of ambitious, non-patronizing, prestige, landmark, intelligent shows that then travel all around the world. I made a couple of Horizons, and the thing I really liked about it was they would be seen by people in, like, I don't know, Colombia. Or you'd have someone come up to you in Australia and say they'd seen it, and I think that's when the BBC is great, when it creates something that's so good that it can go all around the world. I think that's really valuable.
Yeah. Talk about all the way around the world. 2007, you secured the role on Castaway, 7 years after the original series. Ironically, Sir David Attenborough had a similar idea for a TV show in the early 60s, but the concept didn't reach commissioners. With that in mind, why do you think that new millennium was the perfect time to make that sort of experimental series? And what were the fascinating aspects about the series?
So was it 12 people? 12 people were kicked off a boat in the sea and told to swim to shore.
Yeah.
And there's a little rudimentary structure for you, and you can go and live in there. And now you have to raise chickens and grow stuff. And what I loved about it, and this was again through the guy who liked all my stuff. Oh my God. It sounds like I'm getting emotional and choked up. I'm not. I'm fighting that 100-day cough. What was sold to me and what they were trying to do initially was the opposite of the reality shows that were happening at that time. So I had to do a lot of press before it happened. And I was basically telling them that. I was going, there are going to be no evictions. There's going to be no long pauses. This is going to be like a BBC documentary take on these people surviving. And I will be a sort of Attenborough, but with a comedy bent, watching them as a sort of naturalist, and we'll see. And so I did all that. And then it felt like within about 10 days, the BBC weren't happy. The show had been criticised, I think, for taking its time. And before I knew it, I'm standing on a beach going, So it's the first eviction, and suddenly I'm having to do all the things that we weren't going to do. This is my memory of it, but that's certainly what I'd been selling at the time. And then it became a pretty much, you know, a much more of a reality show. But what I remember of it was how quickly, almost like the Stanford prison experiment, where you had where you saw the difference in behavior that like a uniform can bring to a human. I found very quickly when we were in the jeeps going from one part of the set to where the castaways were, it was like a zoo. It was like a zoo. It was like looking at some weird mammals who were grazing or tending to their plants and who had the same sort of concept of us as like an ape would have of a zookeeper. They were sort of conscious we were there, but they wouldn't try and engage or look at us. And we were looking at them going, God, look, there's Joe, there's Jonathan, like you've spotted some precious wild animal in out in the wild somewhere. So it was really weird how quickly we started to think of them as, I don't want to say not human, but as, I suppose it's just free roaming characters, like in a video game or something. And you couldn't wait for them to get out because you wanted to talk to them about all the kind of the drama they've been through. So yeah, it was an unusual experience. Great fun.
Yeah. Just a year later, you replaced Ricky Gervais and inherited the Saturday morning slot on XFM. Looking back now, can you see the embers emerging on this show, which you would have used later in your Radio X show?
I don't know. Maybe. I had starting that show, like it's very strange when you're just told, yeah, you're gonna just go on the radio on Saturday for 4 hours. Because no one's got 4 hours of material. Obviously, there's music and there's adverts and that, but what are you going to do? What are you going to talk about? And so you find your way through, and you know, and they let me bring a friend, Rich Glover, and so we were able to kind of mess about. I suppose it gave me the confidence to just open up a mic now and just start something, talk about whatever. And then later, when I did a breakfast show on XFM, I found that although I would try and make every link as good as it could be and everything had a purpose, there was always a direction to the show. There was always something we knew was going to happen. We'd always have big star guests on, film stars, people like that. So it felt much bigger than it was. You know, it was like trying to punch above its weight. But I also found that I was able to, if you looked over and you saw that suddenly you had 4 seconds before the track ends and you've got to now speak, that can be an anxiety dream for a lot of people. Like, what? I've got to speak. But actually, you can just bring that fader open. And if you can come up with some weird question or idea, you're going to get a few minutes out of it. So I would just bring it up. And I'd say to the newsreader, I'd just go, Matt, I've noticed you've got a new walk. And then he'd just be like, sorry, what? And I was like, yeah, you've got a much more confident stride. And he's like, well, I don't know. And I said, what's making you so confident these days? And then you're off. You've got something to talk about.
Yeah.
Because he'll be responding and then you can listen to what he's saying and just go back and forth. And I think probably having to do 4 hours in those early days with no idea of what I was going to do or say probably did give me that confidence later on to just, you know, attack it.
When we come to when I heard of the company, I really love the idea of reading that.
Just so when we spoke to Gabby Roslin, she spoke about Millennium Night, the broadcast that she did, and
Oh
she
yeah.
was saying that when just as they were about to go live, the auto cue died, and
Oh.
it was the prospect of having to do potentially hours worth of completely live broadcast that with no help. And she sort of said that it was at that moment that she realised she actually really enjoyed that concept of just winging it and just
Yeah.
saying, something's got to go out, so let's get chatting.
They tell you that there are all these sort of media experts who give you advice whether you ask for it or not. Companies employ them and they come in and they tell you stuff, and they would say things like, if there's a mistake, do not mention it. Just get around it. Don't draw the attention to it. And I'm like, no. If there's a mistake, honest, that's where we go. Oh, there's been a mistake, but here's what we're going to do. Blah, blah, blah. Then you're all in it together. The audience is like, oh, there's been a mistake, but they're doing their best. They're getting around it, and this is quite funny actually. It's interesting. It's a peek behind the curtain, and yeah, I sort of like all that. Although weirdly, I've just remembered, I completely forgot this, but when I was a student, I was asked to go on like ghost watches. Because a guy I'd done some work for was setting up like the first ever internet ghost watch. There's going to be cameras all around this like stately home and whatever. And I was brought along as the kind of the man on the street who'd be going, oh, there's spooky stuff happening, but don't worry, it's not really a ghost. Anyway, there was loads of ghosts, or just at least weird stuff that was going on. So by the end, I'm like, yeah, I can't explain this. So they arranged another one, and it's at the Tower of London, and it was going to be on one of the satellite channels, UK Horizons, it was called. And they had all these live cams set up everywhere, and they had a couple of presenters who were from sci-fi shows somewhere, and the woman went missing, and one of the cameras broke. And so suddenly I was just shoved in front of the cameras for what in my head I believe was the opening link of this as it went live, probably to 7 people, but still, I suddenly have a camera in my face, and I'm just suddenly having to go, welcome to the Ghost Watch, live from the Tower of London here on UK Horizons. And I can see all these people in the background like, I wasn't supposed to be presenting. I wasn't a presenter. Yet somehow I made my debut that evening. And then I think after that one link, I think I completely disappeared for the rest of the night. So people must have been going, who was that guy at the start? Who was sort of kicking the whole thing off? We never saw him again. Because I was downstairs. Ghosts.
Seems ridiculous to ask this question in 2024 when there are unlimited avenues for people to have a platform. But to what extent has your journalistic credibility given you more of a reputation as a broadcaster? And how difficult is it to separate your broadcasting career from your role as a journalist? And what do you think are the advantages of crossing that threshold?
Well, I think probably there's a funny thing that happens with when people talk about people who've maybe, done telly or whatever, but also write books. The strange thing about me is I ended up doing telly and then, as a result, lots of other things. Because I was an author, because I was writing books, which I wouldn't have done unless I'd trained myself up writing lots for magazines and newspapers and so on. And so it's rare that an author ends up being like a game show host or doing documentaries, unless those documentaries are incredibly specialist. You're kind of Mary Beards or Alice Roberts or whatever. And the kind of writing that I've done, journalism-wise, there's been a couple of serious things, but really it's always with jokes. jokes are at the heart of everything. I'm attracted to jokes. I can't get away from them. It's sort of like a bit of an instinct within writing, which I've had to sort of train myself not to do, and I've had to train myself to take them out sometimes. Um, but perhaps I think a combination of writing and wearing glasses has probably lent me more credibility in certain areas than I would have had otherwise. I think maybe I wouldn't have been the first person to present legendary science show Horizon if I had perfect eyesight. I think probably the fact that I wear glasses means that if I can tell a joke, that's a bonus, because they're like, well, he clearly reads books. Look at his eyes. So I think that, yeah, I've benefited a bit from, I've benefited a lot from having something else I do. I don't rely on any one thing. And I get certain jobs because of other things. So telly from books, radio was probably from a bit of telly. Journalism can lead to scripts. You have an idea, and then they'll go, oh, do you want to maybe think about turning that into something? Being good in the room helps, where if you're pitching, and it happens much more in America, where they're much more serious but open and much more educated in terms of how scripts work. American executives read scripts all the time, and they know how to read scripts, and they know where the jokes are. And I found, in the past, you almost have to write the word joke in big letters and underline it and put an arrow next to a joke if it isn't someone falling over here. And so that's not a huge, well, it is a criticism, but it's I think that, yeah, I've benefited from being in lots of different worlds and doing lots of different things and seeing lots of great people doing what they do.
Because being a broadcaster on mainstream radio remains one of the most high-profile roles in entertainment. And to what extent do you have a responsibility to echo, chart, and celebrate the fashion and fads of the time?
I don't think you have any, really. I think you do what feels right, and things develop. You can't really tell in what direction they're going to develop. Sometimes it's like creating a little club. My radio show, for whatever reason, from what I started on the breakfast show, I suppose, to what's happened now, has turned into a semi-authoritarian regime, particularly because I want to do things that you're not supposed to do. So I'll point out all the mistakes constantly. I will always raise the veil on what's happening behind the scenes or how we do certain things. Because I think listeners, if they like a show, they're probably interested in that stuff. They want to know what you're up to. I'll tell the listener to shut up. I will start a link by going, all right, shut up now, please. I am talking, as if what I've got to do and say is more important than the billion things that could be happening in people's homes. But and also, and I'll trust listeners to be able to handle more than one thought in one link. So you can have multiple things going on at once, because that's what it's like down the pub, or that's what it's like when you see your mates. These are all normal things, and I really like the people who do that kind of stuff, and I enjoy doing it as well. So I think rather than following fads and fashions, you can create your own little world within the confines of your time slot.
So penultimate question. Looking back at your career, what's your proudest achievement?
There's something that makes me proud all the time, because it's constantly evolving. And I wrote a book called Join Me, which was all about how I started my own cult. See, I think leadership and community is something that I've found I write about a lot. I started a cult. I started a country on BBC Two. I now run an authoritarian regime. there's something wrong with me, I think, that I have to I'm just drawn to the ludicrousness of that kind of authoritarianism. But join me, I wanted to see whether people would join something without knowing who they were joining or what they were joining or why they were joining. And they had to send me a passport photo. And the only real rule, the only real thing became that on a Friday, you had to make the Friday a Good Friday by doing a random act of kindness for a stranger. And to this day, I get emails. Over the years, I've had, God, hundreds of thousands probably of letters and communications and postcards and messages of little tiny acts of kindness that have taken place that have somehow changed a moment or a day or maybe a person. And that's not me having done that. That's other people almost having been given permission to do it, or a reason to do it, or the idea that there are other people doing it, so they felt free to do it. It's them doing it, and it's them changing that moment or person or whatever. But I'm part of it, and they feel that they want to tell me that. And so that, combined with Yes Man and the people who get in touch with me having decided I'm going to say yes now to something that normally I wouldn't have said yes to, and it leading to one of countless marriages, you know, relationships, job changes, emigrations, children. When I hear these stories, I'm like, it's like it is like throwing that pebble into that pond, and then seeing the ripples, and hearing about them afterwards, the good stories. Thankfully, no one seems to have died. No one seems to have entered into an awful relationship because of me. Or if they have, they haven't told me. And I'd like to keep it that way.
Yeah, fair enough.
Why wrong? Stay cool. Cool. But what? So, what is
Josh asked if you were involved with Dave Gorman and the Google hack, and could you tell everyone what it is?
The Google hack, I was not. No, I wasn't really involved in. A slight bit of, you know, I was aware there were these things going on. It was a funny old time, and we did what we did. Are You Dave Gorman? Where we went and tried to find or not find 54 people all with the same name, and I'm yet all these years later to meet. No, I'm not. I was about to say I'm yet to meet another Danny Wallace, so I kind of got the rough end of that deal, but I didn't. I met one. I met one some years back, Daniel Wallace, who is also a writer and writes. He wrote the novel Big Fish. You might have ended up with him today instead of me if you'd done it all by email. And so I've only met I haven't met that many, but it was a really good time of creativity and energy and fun, and it was around that time I was doing the Boosh as well and Ross Noble. So life was just funny. It was just I mean life, thankfully, in this kind of work, as you know, you sort of you do get to meet a lot of funny people, so you do spend a lot of time laughing, and that's really all I want to do.
So, last question: what's next for Danny Wallace?
Well, what is next? I've got a new book out in May, which is a strange. Well, it's a look at the world of conspiracy and lies and trolls and all the things that we were talking about earlier with media studies and what we can be prepared for. A world that's about to change, a world that none of us really know what it's going to be like in the next 15 years. Or what to prepare, or you know how we're going to cope with it, or what AI is going to bring. And perhaps we think it's going to be disastrous. Perhaps we think it's going to be incredibly boring as we wade through false information every 5 minutes. I've made it sound like a terrible book. It's actually fun. It's called Somebody Told Me. What I was doing right before I talked to you, and what I'm going to go back to in a moment, is a script that I'm putting together, an idea that I sold to Apple. So there were 2 drawers it could go in. One is it could be made, or it could go with almost every other script I've ever written in another drawer that no one has ever seen. So we'll see, and then we crack on.
Josh said he knows the feeling of that one. That's a but yeah, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.